As we were just about to break for coffee, we had to stop because there was really an urgent call to the right to a break and the right to refreshment. That eventually resulted in our good friend Mukapa being punished twice, um, missing the flight and taking 72 hours to get here, only to be rudely interrupted by a moderator. So I committed to make up with him in honor of his resilience by giving him the first 2 minutes before we jump over to Jamie so that he can just make his quick reflections and concluding remarks. Also responding, I think there was one or two observations that were made on his presentation. So Mukapa, it's 2 minutes. Let's stick to that and before you get the unfortunate reality again.
Just like Kenyan Airways. Thank you very much for that opportunity. I think I just want to respond to the two questions that were asked. CDF, how does it work? CDF is actually a game changer in Zambia.
That's a constituency development fund.
Yes, constituency development fund. Initially, the amount was about 1.6 million, but currently it has gone to about 2.7, which is actually, yes, which is a plus for us as Zambia, because currently we are seeing a lot of projects being run by the local authorities and so on and so forth. Now, however, what is the role of the local authority there? What the government does usually is simply to deposit funds in the local authority accounts. Then it will stay there until the citizens actually apply or probably make proposals of certain projects that they would want to do. They usually apply to what is known as the CDF committee. Okay? The CDF committee is a combination of different stakeholders. Of course, the minister is always there representing government. And once they do apply, there is a project list that is always released by CDFC of approved projects. However, once the approval is done, that list has to go now to the provincial government. There's a man or woman who holds a position of provincial local government officers. They are the ones who end up now approving, giving the final approval of those projects so that the funds could be disbursed. And after the approval has been done, the list usually goes back now to the local authority to disburse those funds. So their role is just to receive the monies and disburse the monies. One thing that stands out is that, local authorities don't really play a major role when it comes to the releasing of CDF, because the decisions are made by another tier, the provincial government. They are the ones who make those decisions. And at the end of the day, in terms of accountability, it's very difficult to hold the council to be accountable for those funds, because the ones who approve are actually the provincial government. So the question is, does the central government control those funds? Yes, they do. How do they do it? Through the provincial local government officers. The provincial local government officers are actually a part of the Ministry of Local Government. Oh, I talk too much. Eh?
No, I mean, like you can wrap up in 30 seconds.
The role of leaders, the traditional leaders in councils. The law is that whenever a traditional leader goes into the council, they cease to be recognized as such. They become councillors. That's what the law says. Even when you are to refer to them, you refer to them as councillors. But yeah, you know how Africa is, eh? Yeah. They are appointed, but they are now referred to as councillors. You know where traditional leaders are. They should usually go in local authorities with their influence. And as Africans, sometimes you just have to let go of certain, pertinent issues that we can actually try to come up with, just to make sure that, things move in a certain direction, because they do have the power sometimes just to veto everything. I can give you a good example. Minutes were written in the council, things were approved in the council. At this point in time, this traditional leader felt that the decision was not in her best interest. And she just said that this thing cannot go on, and everything was cancelled. Everything is on a standstill. So that's what traditional leaders do. Simply because we've got a dual system of land administration in Zambia. Much of the land is under traditional leaders. Government just has a few of it, and as such. Anyway.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mukapa, for that. And once again, thank you all the panelists for the great interventions we had. And I think that was really the best way to conclude, reflecting on perspectives on decentralization from various angles, from the federal context, from Francophone Africa, and then from Southern Africa. And in the end, I think we can again come back to the discussion. It's all politics, but it's more than politics. It also requires really active engagement of the citizenry. And it requires a lot of research. It requires a lot of knowledge. It requires a lot of, influencing. And I think it's in that context that we find ourselves as advocates. Now, we are going to transit then into this very last session of today, which is a very important session. If you recall yesterday, Jami made this observation, which was just an observation, and it will not happen. What if the plane crashed and Jami was involved? What would happen? So we don't want to wish him that, and we don't wish anyone of that, but we really want to think about the future and think about sustainability, think about, beyond this meeting, what next? And I think there's so much that has been discussed this far. We try to tie everything together. So the order of discussions will be as follows. Jami will be given about 5 minutes to just make very quick introductory remarks. Then Judy and Japie will provoke us with some key arguments and questions and reflections. And thereafter, the floor is going to be open. We have to conclude at 5 o'clock exactly before we run into serious problems. Jami.
Just on the last thing, we probably all want to take a little bit of time off, especially kick off the shoes and heels before we reconvene at 7 to go to dinner, right? I'll be very brief. I don't know if I'm screen sharing. What I am hoping to do, especially since KK joined us after taking care of important government business, I'm fortunate and some of you are fortunate we don't have those dual roles. Just to recap some of the key takeaways that I heard. Now, this is by no means a replacement of the more formal workshop report that will be collectively prepared, but I thought it'd be good just to pick on a few of the main messages, at least through what I heard, to inform the discussion going forward. And I'm going to avoid flying airplanes in the very near future, the way we're talking. Okay, the first thing I heard, again, to inform the discussion subsequently, is that there is no one single motivation for decentralization and localization in Africa. It should not be pursued in a one-size-fits-all manner. It's a process, not an endpoint, and it's a means to an end. The local public sector can be defined, as I shared with you yesterday, as the part of the public sector that interacts with citizens, civil society, and the private sector in a localized manner. So it's more than just decentralization. But as far as I could tell from your contributions, all countries share an ambition towards greater inclusion and public sector or local public sector effectiveness. So that is something everyone has in common. Different countries in Africa are at different places in their journey towards inclusive and efficient local public sector and opt for different approaches. Some countries prefer to limit the use of decentralization and local governance institutions as platforms of public participation. Others are more ambitious and are pursuing devolution where there the local governments are truly empowered. And even though we may not like it, sometimes we have to accept that it is what it is. When we get really concerned is when there are significant mismatches between the stated decentralization ambitions and the actual situation. If a country says, we want to be devolved, and we look at the actual situation and they're not devolved, that is a pretty grave concern. So if you claim to pursue devolution, then it's reasonable for an assessment to take place to make sure that you are not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. It is important to understand and acknowledge that different countries are taking different approaches, because otherwise we're comparing apples and oranges if we're simply looking at different local governments. So we need evidence to ensure a deeper and more honest understanding of the state of local governance, perhaps looking at Europe, where peer reviews are better than central government reviews of how well they're doing themselves on any type of decentralization. I think I heard that where a country is on its decentralization journey is largely determined by national political priorities. Lack of political will, as came up this morning, to decentralize or localize by central politicians or central bureaucrats. And yesterday we said that includes the Ministry of Local Government, is actually a natural phenomenon. We may hope for progress on devolution, but wishing won't make it so. We probably need to be realistic. I'm quoting Jackie here, who whispered in my ear, power is taken, power is not given. So you must claim that power, and that is very hard for the common man or the common woman to do. This is true for local governments who want to be empowered. This is also true for people who want to be empowered over their local governments. Those are both contested power situations that need to be played out. If a country's leadership is motivated to move to a different stage of or mechanism of decentralization, the technical next steps are informed by where they actually are on their decentralization journey. So it's important to know what your true starting point is. Even when there is political will, and it was mentioned even in the previous session, if the president says so, the president's word may not go, it may just be lip service to the election. And in addition, there are political economy obstacles or bureaucratic resistance. Implementation, typo, is very common. And a big bang may be the only way to secure progress, because if you don't go big bang, there's time for the forces to collude against decentralization. One more thought is participatory mechanisms and community level engagement are critical, regardless of whether the country pursues devolution or non-devolved decentralization or approaches to decentralization and localization. Participation is important. In devolved countries, citizens may actually have an ally in the central government because you can make what's called an accountability sandwich. The central government may impose transparency norms that allow citizens to be more involved and participatory and hold local governments to account. 2 or 3 things that stood out in my mind about what LPSA can do, but this is really for handing over to the next discussion. From what I've heard, it's helpful for countries to have a comparative assessment of the nature and state of local governance and decentralization or multi-level governance systems so that they can assess where they are in this journey. Peer review mechanisms may be helpful to ensure objectivity, and there may be a potential role for LPSA to support developing the capacity within Africa to engage in comparative analysis. Data came up, subnational data on subnational finance and results by function or SDG disaggregated at the county level or disaggregated at the local level would be very important in terms of better service delivery localization, both in non-devolved and devolved countries. So it's a way to escape the decentralization stamp. We can talk about decentralization without using the word. We say localization of SDGs. It's non-political, but we might use that as a cover. And in devolved countries, it's also a very good way to ensure better local accountability. There may be possibilities here, again, for LPSA to help elevate the debate by assessing the availability of disaggregated data, and if data is available, to use that data to link public spending and public results at the local level. And the final thought, there are different views in the community of practice and in this room about the degrees, about the ambitions and the degree of activism, right? Local government associations might want to empower local government, civil society wants more participation, central government has its view. But at the core, what is it that unites us? Where are the areas where we can all agree? I think there's probably more in common than we think, and that common denominator is probably the area where LPSA can be the most useful platform to move the dialogue forward. With those comments, I think it was probably 4 minutes, not 3, but hopefully I'll be paying for the wine.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Yes, you just committed, and we deliver on our commitments. You have a good example next to you. We go straight to Yapi and to reflect briefly also on how can we get forward from here.
Thank you so much, Chair. And let me then take the baton from Jamie and just get us started on a discussion on how can we operationalize some of these ideas and optimize the use of this network. So what I'll do is I'll go through 3 slides with some preliminary ideas, which Jamie kindly helped me to draft. So we all sort of in doing this in unison. And then Judy will facilitate a discussion amongst the members of this group here, just to see how we can refine those ideas, complement them, remove some ideas, and just reflect on how we take the LPSA network forward. And particularly, of course, the Sub-Saharan Africa Working Group, because the idea is that LPSA practices what it preaches, it devolves, it decentralizes, and we have a lot of discretion how we want to pursue our own objectives. So the first thing that we may want to reflect on is if we want to pursue, sort of and deepen the collaboration through LPSA, do we know who our membership is and who our audience is? If you think of your own countries, who would be the audience that you would want to be reached by the activities of LPSA? Central Ministry officials, and in most of our countries, that'll be a Ministry of Local Government, or bearing some sort of similar name, or a Ministry of Finance, but there could also be specific intergovernmental bodies, particularly in constitutions that have sort of a bit of a federal slant. There would be specific intergovernmental bodies and institutions. It is on. Yeah. So I'll speak even further into the mic. If I go any closer, I'll swallow it. Local government officials, local government associations have been mentioned very often as part of the audience of our activities, but also leading policy experts, academics, researchers, civil society organizations, and development partners. Those would be, I think, at least suggested members of the audience that we want to reach with our activities, of course, in various shapes, forms, and sizes. We can also consider whether we need to establish sort of sub-regional anchor institutions. Are there specific institutions that are part of LPSA or could be part of LPSA that could function as an anchor institution, taking some of the specific activities forward or carrying more specific elements of the strategy? So it's good to reflect on that. Who do we want to reach with our activities? Is it this broad umbrella of institutions and individuals, or do we want to be more specific or nuanced in addition to this? So the next slide is then on the kind of activities that we could expand on. Of course, we all know the webinars. We've been having these wonderful, thoughtful, enriching webinars over the last 2 years, discussing various topics related to decentralization. We know about the Logica project and the very sort of comprehensive and detailed and useful analysis that it provides. How can we build on that? Should we perhaps look at a regional approach to some of these institutional assessments? Because it is a bit of a discussion about how far can you go with a country by country analysis? Does that at some point still produce value add every time you add a new country? Or do you think, okay, let's have a regional approach, a more specific approach by sub-region, see what's the state of play when it comes to decentralization in this region, and use that as an advocacy and knowledge exchange activity. We've said a lot about who does what, functional assignments, and the discrepancies between what would be the stated intent, what could even be the constitutional configuration or listing of functions, and what actually happens in practice. Is that something we want to take forward in a specific activity and actually do an assessment of the de facto functional assignments supporting decentralization in Africa? And then mapping the availability of localized or locally disaggregated finance and results data. I think heard a lot of support already in the conversations around we need to make a contribution to the availability, the public availability of data on decentralization and localization. There is data out there, but it's fragmented. It's sitting in various pockets, in various computers, in drawers, in institutions. There are countries where data is shared quite, effectively. We are very fortunate in South Africa with a statistics agency and a national treasury that churns out data very regularly and makes it publicly available. But that's not the case in many other countries on the continent. What contribution can we make through our networks and the access that we have to individuals, to institutions, to support it? And are there specific existing systems that we may want to latch onto, such as the UN system on subnational voluntary review methodology? Is that something we would want to link with and latch onto and perhaps support? But if so, how would we do that? And how do we get the right actors involved, and how do we fund it? Because those activities are expensive to run. We could also, adopt a more case study approach, look at selected countries. For example, if you take the message that Jamie just put out, if you take that forward, say, well, if you are a country with a very robust stated intent on devolution, well, let's have it then. Let's have a look at it and see whether that stated intention is matched by reality. And one can do that in the form of an analysis of whether the country is adhering to certain decentralization principles that we can then formulate. And I think going around the room, the kind of things that we've been discussing for the last 2 days, there's a broad agreement on what those decentralization principles could contain. Not selling them as beliefs, as paradigms, but rather as if this is your stated intent, and then this is actually what that means. The idea of peer review, I think, is a very useful one, because if you analyze it from within a country as an expert of that country, or if you analyze it as an outside expert, knowing perhaps not that much about the country, there's limits and dynamics in both ways of assessing it. But a peer review mechanism may in fact remove a lot of the I suppose static in the kind of analysis that is then conducted. We've also spoken about sort of, do we need to sort of tackle specific countries with a sort of maybe a bit of a hard-hitting kind of policy brief on this is LPSA's assessment of the state of decentralization in this particular country. And this is what we think are ways of moving forward. Again, just ideas, throwing out items so that we can brainstorm. Then the third slide, last slide, is on the networking dimension of LPSA. We have the working group, and we will continue to meet regularly in our webinars. But how can we strengthen the capacity of our members and member institutions, specifically for that evidence-based policy analysis? I think there's broad agreement that there's not enough of that happening at a comparative, in-depth, thoughtful level. We have institutions and networks across Africa that promote and advocate and lobby, but how do we bring together the expert evidence-based policy analysis? And how do we build capacity on the continent to conduct that in a way that really supports decentralization and localization? We've got the annual African School on Decentralization, which runs from the Dalla Omar Institute, which is now partnering with LPSA. It's one small example, of, a momentum of annual bringing together of practitioners in a school for 2 weeks, earning a certificate and going through a very rigorous process of learning about evidence-based analysis of decentralization from various angles. Now, that can be an example of something that can provide momentum to this Pan-African network on decentralization, because every year that you come together, there's a group, that group goes out, they become sort of alumni, they spread the word, they remain part of the network, bring new people in, and you sort of build over time a network of expert specialists, so to speak, in decentralization that have all sort of gone through a fairly rigorous, but also a normative school on decentralization. Do we need to look at specific skills for the peer review of these local multi-level governance systems? If you want to do a rigorous analysis on a peer review basis of decentralization, you need to do it according to a certain methodology. We've listened to how Nick presented, the methodology. There's a rigor, there's an objectivity to it that I think is very useful and important to maintain and build on, so that we can replicate that on the African continent. Then lastly, do we have a sufficiently strong academic environment on decentralization in Africa? Are there enough institutions, centers, departments within universities that have a focus on this? We all know of probably many sort of individual academics sitting in departments, pursuing studies in topics related to decentralization. Do we need to promote the establishment of specific units or centers of excellence, that can really carry research and engagement on decentralization? Because individual academics can only do so much unless they are brought into a broader network of engagement on decentralization issues. So these are just a few ideas, just to flight some suggestions, and we look forward to hearing, does any of this make sense? Any suggestions, any additions, deductions that you want to make? And for that, I then hand over to Judy.
Thank you so much, Japie. I think we can give the group a big round of applause. Yes, so really it's our time and it's our turn. And the colleagues have highlighted 3 areas that can guide our reflections, but it's also possible that maybe one could identify an additional area of further reflection. Just to remind ourselves, there's an issue around our membership and our audience, the issue about what kind of activities we could be doing, and how we could strengthen the Africa capacity for evidence-based policy analysis. Maybe first question just at that level. Apart from these 3 areas, is there another area that one would say, in addition, we actually need to flag this and we need to reflect on that particular area as part of this conversation before we go into some details? Okay, it looks like the framing is fairly reflecting what otherwise have been the feeling in the room? Okay.
Just trying to get a clarification.
Yes,
so
please.
the subject is on the working group and the call for a Pan-African network. And within, and most of us in the LPSA sub-working group are already members of other working groups around the LPSA. How do we reconcile some of that? So just maybe not as a topic, but what are some of those cross-cutting areas to avoid duplication or I mean, I'm just trying to think a bit from the LPSA wide through the other thematic groups that we're a part of, and where does that fit in?
Maybe there use the prerogative of being an executive director. On that very question, let's park that question till tomorrow afternoon, because that will be work planning for LPSA specific. And so that is a very legitimate question, but tomorrow we'll talk nitty gritty based on today's conversation about those kind of internal issues.
Just to remind you that I'm still chairing this session, so please address me, even regardless of executive or not.
I just wanted to add one small further sort of suggestion, which it's not on the slides, but what do we as LPSA do with the charter? Do we see it as something that we want to rally around? It's there. There's in fact the African Charter on Democracy, which also has a decentralization provision in it, which could perhaps even be more pointy than the African Charter on Decentralization, which hasn't even been fully adopted yet. Do we see that as something we want to rally around, or is that too much of a pie in the sky? Yeah, so just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And we come to KK.
Yeah. Just clarification on the selected countries and the peer review. Do you mean to say that we approach, let's say, the AU or an umbrella body, and to see the IPSA as potentially being able to peer review for the countries, because or we as members of IPSA and also represent the specific countries on our own, we peer review our own countries. So I want to know the level. That is it our own peer review of our countries, on which perhaps wouldn't go that far. It may be academic, and we can do that as we are doing here. But if we approach, let's say the AU, say your member countries have signed to decentralization charter, and that we, as IPSA, could provide an independent peer review and all get this done, like the African peer review mechanism that I think there was an organization in South Africa that was doing that. It is something like that. I just want clarification.
No, just very, very briefly. It's an open canvas, and anything is possible. But I think, just realistically, whether LPSA partnering with the AU into a peer review mechanism, how much time, energy, investment is then going to take just to get the AU's attention for this? I mean, to give you an example, last year we organized the African School on Decentralization in Addis, focus on the African Charter, and we struggled tremendously to get the African Union just to even show the slightest bit of interest. Even though we were there, we were funding it, we were in Addis about their topic. So, yeah, I think there's an operational consideration there. That's just my own. But Judy, I don't know what you think.
Oh, you're still chair. Yes. Thank you. I think some of those things are things we could start highlighting as we begin answering the questions. Because I would like us to begin so that we can find time to also put it there, because we have somebody recording. And then one by one, we can start saying, this really stands strong for us to be able to elevate. This is really critical for us to pick up and run with. Of course, we also, and thank you, Jamie, for responding to Paddy's question. we will now try to isolate even some of these issues tomorrow, so that we don't now start eating into the working group, thematic work group session, webinars and activities. So that would be my proposal, Chair.
Thank you very much. So just to structure the conversation again, we wanted to identify other areas that we want to reflect on further. And so far, I think the issue of elevating the debate by engaging the AU, particularly through interrogating the Africa Charter on elections, governance, and democracies is one area, and therefore being more ambitious. We've noted that. Yes, and we'll come back to Boris.
This is something that has been bothering me since yesterday and today. But following what Keke said, and then also what Jamie said in his introduction, I think our identity, our DNA, should be clear on this. And I think Jamie keeps using the word the process. Decentralization is a process. But it can also be an outcome or an end in itself. If we believe that it empowers people, whatever people do with the empowerment is another thing. If we always say it's a process to achieve service delivery, but also democracy to empower people, people should be able to participate in their own development. Whether that leads to what they want, that's another thing. People should be able to elect their municipal chief executive or the mayor and should not be imposed by the center. If that helps to deliver services, that is another thing. But we all know that democracy hasn't delivered what we all wanted, but we always fight for democracy. So when we, as LPSA, insist that for us, our DNA is to make it's a decentralization, it's a process. But we are going to advocate for decentralization as a process, whether some people go to the delegation, other people go to devolution, other people go, But based on what Keke said, that this is something which is good, and if devolution is what we believe that is good, I think why can't we push for it and see whatever happens with it, than always to think that, oh, it's a process. It's a process. And we never see the end. So I just want us to think through whether when we are conceptualizing our entry point, whether it is always to see how decentralization is a process. So some can go to delegation, devolution, and yes, let's work with it. But can't we also say what comes out is also important, is some empowering the people? Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is becoming more interesting and difficult for the moderator to even manage, because yes. So I think Boris has had his hand up, and then yes, we'll come back to here. Yes.
All right. I see my role as sharing experience. So rather than giving suggestions, I'd like to share experience. On the voluntary subnational reviews, I think that's quite a useful instrument to look into. Obviously, it can be a very good instrument for evidence-based advocacy, because that can be an opportunity to gather data, to gather the state of play, the views. Obviously, have many goals that concern sector policies, but we usually highlight two goals that are very relevant also in this context. Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities, and Goal 17, partnerships for the goals. So this is about localization and about multi-level governance for us. There is quite a lot of work already done about subnational voluntary reviews, how to do them. There are guidelines at the UCLG, published methodology, how to make voluntary subnational reviews. There is an online course by UCLG, how to do voluntary subnational reviews. We, with UCLG and Platforma, we did a training module on SDGs in decentralized development cooperation. That's another contribution to how to include these. UN Habitat published guidelines on how to do voluntary subnational reviews. Even if in Europe we usually try to convince local governments in Europe, don't only do your voluntary subnational review, but try to insert yourself into the national voluntary reviews, to have actually, you know, the hand in both. And there are also excellent examples from Africa, and Kenya is one of the best, because last year it was already the second voluntary subnational review that was done by Kenya, by the Council of Governors. County assemblies. Last year, Rwanda and Tanzania published voluntary subnational reviews. The year before, Botswana, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Cape Verde, Tunisia, Zimbabwe. There is already a lot done. So this can be a good basis to construct also, let's say, political advocacy, evidence-based and database advocacy through this instrument, which we promote a lot. So.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Very briefly, in the list of the membership, I was thinking about inclusion of traditional institutions, potentially, I mean, good audience, given we are in Africa. African societies are cultural societies. Many of traditional and informal institutions closely work with the local governments and also influence the decentralization process. So we can potentially think of including local traditional institutions in the list of audience membership, the ones that you have listed down. And as a follow-up to what Honorable KK pointed out, by way of questioning, does decentralization matter in terms of cultural and the traditional institutions in Africa? This could be also, I mean, the points that we have to add in the list of questions that Mr. KK has already pointed out. As much as it is related to socio-economic transformation and political issues, our decentralization process in the African context should also be related to the cultural and the traditional institutions, so to say. And again, as a follow-up to what Nicholas pointed out, the issue of decentralization as a means and decentralization as a need is a very important question to think about. If we, I mean, pretend to look decentralization only as a process and as a means for attaining something else, but not as a value and as an end in and of itself, I think that would lead us to, I mean, less emphasis on the importance and relevance of decentralization. And in fact, there is no, it is not, this means and end are not mutually exclusive when it comes to decentralization issue. The principles, the means and the processes of decentralization are expected to bring something good, which is valuable, and that is the end. And this end is, could be taken as values and virtues of decentralization. I think it is good to think mutually inclusive relation between the means and the end of decentralization. And these are the points that I want to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are really now going into the details, and it's fine, to be very honest. We can go back and forth. But so far, it seems like in terms of the critical areas, the pillars of this conversation, we seem to be agreeable that in addition to the three areas, the issue of engaging or elevating the discussion to the AU level, including the charter, I think that has been adopted. The issue that you are mentioning, I think it belongs to areas that we can deal with in terms of activities as part of the evidence-based discussions and analysis, including the role of traditional institutions, to which I think one can add political parties too, as discussed earlier. Judy, you had a hand up, or oh no, it was not Judy, it was Paddy.
This is what happens when we engage with Malawi, Chair.
This is the problem. I mean, it really goes very
we are
long.
Too close. We're too close to home.
Exactly. Yes, Paddy.
Thank you, Chair. I was just thinking that instead of thinking about it as an area, I actually think it's part of what we bring forward. You know, our engagement with the African Union. I mean, I would see any document. I mean, we're talking about setting up a network. So the preamble for that is how we want to elevate that discussion to that level, and really also talking about making sure that, we are there to support, because what's the interest for the African Union to engage with us? I always think about it in the other way around. We have a clear interest, but what's their added value? They've been trying to get countries to sign up to various charters. They don't get them to. So all of a sudden, a group of people come and say, we would like to engage with you on these charters. What's our value addition? So I think rather than putting it as something, it's our chapeau, basically. It's what we sort of carry and say, these are some of the things we think could be meaningful to engage with us. Not just holding your instruments, but trying to see how these instruments would make sense for the decentralization agenda in the different countries. And I think on the question whether, I'm a bit confused whether who our membership and our audience are, because I think it's two different spaces, because we may end up having everybody as a member and everybody as an audience. So sort of also disaggregating a little bit what we see as the membership of the network and what we see as a targeted audience for us who would drive the agenda. And for instance, I see, traditional leaders and political actors who may not maybe show up to some of what we may put together in terms of the big thinkers around the room, but they are indeed a very important audience and target for some things that we produce out of the network to put into their hands and drive forward the agenda on decentralization. Also finding what incentives would be for them. I also thought what Boris shared was very important in line with everything we've put down on the evidence-based policy. I think we need to get a better understanding of ourselves, what instruments are there already, what's already being done, and then we're building on top of those instruments. So the same with the peer review mechanisms, we need maybe a better understanding of how does that work. And then engagement with the African Union, for instance, on this would help us to understand from the countries, for instance, that have signed up to the Charter, is there any actual monitoring that they just haven't pasted on the website? Because that's also a very big possibility. It's about the contacts you have within the African Union. I think many of us know that sometimes you may be told, no, they submit reports, and you're like, but the website doesn't have it. No, we don't post anything there. I don't know, Webmaster, something happened to it, but the reports are available. And this is, this is the other thing that we have with data. That data is sitting with, it's sitting with folks in their computers and drives and all this, and sometimes just doesn't get to us. So I think we need to have a better understanding of that, so that as we move forward on even suggesting a better version of a peer review mechanism, we have a very clear understanding of what has come of whatever is existing at the moment. And that's probably part of our first agenda point with the African Union, those who've signed up, but also questions around when they have spoken to countries that have not signed up, what's stalling in the process. And that understanding is very enriching for us as we go forward, because then we don't, one, repeat the same mistakes they've made in terms of trying to get ratification and not getting it, but also it makes us kind of be, I always think also with the African Union, we can't reach all 54, but if we reach 15, maybe we have a good level of going to something. And then the 15, you find champions in there who drag the other 30 plus. So there's also that dynamic that we have to work in. Where do we identify our champions? And maybe those are an essential member for our membership to be part of that, because they're the ones who give us the legitimacy. And that's the last point I was going to make. Because when we knock on the door of the African Union, and sometimes they're very blunt. I work on diaspora engagement with the African Union. First question, who are you? Who sent you? So that needs to build in having government members or, as part of us who've already got connections to them, who secure not just the appointment, but secure space in their hearts, literally, to listen to what we have to put across. So I think influencers are very important for us to think about, rather than just opening up the membership to everyone and everyone and not really being able to achieve what we would like. I'll end there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that clarification between membership and the audience. I think it's a very important distinction to make. Thankfully, you've also clarified in terms of who potentially should be considered as members, and I think Jamie yesterday also clarified already how the local, the LPSA is conceived and structured in terms of membership. We can always enrich that. KK.
and effective. It needs to be unbundled. And it needs to be unbundled in this form. That what I think they are wanting to achieve, make sure that centralization is. I think they are going to make it inclusive and effective. You need to put the ifs, that effectiveness for that inclusive. And in that context, on the other hand, I think you will only be true to it professionally, academically, to the extent that you are not shy to say that you aspire to be the standard bearers of good centralization practices. I think it should be as clear that you seek to be made to be educated, even because I'm not to be reading as much as you've been reading. These days I'm just in Kenya. But if I think you have come in to build some points. And that point, from what I can understand at one of my conversations, is that today, you know, if you ask somebody about good investment, business environment, you go to World Bank Index. Am I correct? Right? Or, you know, are we together? If you ask somebody to go for domestic resource mobilization, you go to Tandat Mahel. Are we together? I think, in my mind, if you move towards creating that kind of an index, even as people do self-evaluation or whatever else they do, and if as part of this, you can be telling us, you know, who is doing well, who is not doing well against that index. And in the context where now you bring in the African Union Declaration, you know, they wanted to do this, but, you know, I mean, we are not getting there, and we need to get an indication we are not getting there. And just to cut it short, let me say that I think, in my mind, whether you are in the terms of membership and so on, you know, the most important thing you can do, because you are not within government, thought leadership. And thought leadership, it is thought leadership, it is knowledge sharing. And, you know, to that extent, then I would say there is no limit to how ambitious you can be. You can only be limited by capacity. But if you are a Pan-African institution, you know, you have somebody who can handle some aspects of this in Malawi, somebody who can handle it in South Africa, somebody who can handle it in Kenya. I think you can come up with something much better than AFDP's governance indicators for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are being challenged to really be more than what we thought we can, which I think is good. It's Jabi and Jami. So, this is why you need central government. So, Jami.
All right. No, just some thoughts and thinking out loud, and I really appreciate the open discussion. There are, and I think it's really good to be strong and say, as a working group aspiring to be a regional network, advocacy should be a more important part. And I think that is something that the working group should take forward and push back on to me. And that is a challenge for us globally, but that's why we're aspiring towards greater autonomy for the working group. That's the whole point of the exercise. If everyone in the world would be the same, we wouldn't need regional working groups, right? Just one or two observations on the legal instruments. And now I'm not a lawyer, so I'm putting myself at grave risk of having my head chopped off by the experienced lawyers in the room. With the verbiage that Boris cited this morning, there's always a caveat, because I figure lawyers are very clever, and it says, right, there should be democratic local government, comma, as per national legislation. So they've given themselves an out. And they'll all say, no, our legislation says this, and we've complied with our legislation, and they'll walk away. So likewise, the African Charter is not the African Charter on Local Self-Government. It's on the principles of local self-government. And on page 47, clause 2BC, it says, as per national legislation. So there's a loophole. It probably was invented by Donald Trump when he changed the tax law or something to make sure that his own interests were served. I think from an LPSA point of view, we attach value in our policy, not in our founding charter, but in our policies, we refer to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 21, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. Now, my country is not a signatory, but I hope Kenya is, and I hope other countries are. It was written in part by Eleanor Roosevelt, but in the infinite wisdom of my country, we're not there. But I think it is a recognized principle. Part 2 of the same article, everyone has the right to equal access to public service in his country. Now, a little bit paternalistic, his country, not his or her country. But that minor detail aside, equal access across your national territory is something we know something about, right? So there is a very strong, in my view, and this is in LPSA's policies, to me, 2 very strong articles to say this gives us, beyond even what the African Union does or does not do, gives us a raison d'etre and a reason to engage, because this transcends even the rather inadequate and incomplete charters that are based. And politically, I think you have some very strong motivations. I just wanted to add that on the table. Now, some of you are much more experienced at running nonprofit organizations, and I look forward to learning from you. One thing I have learned, that there's, as an economist, I know this theoretically, but now I'm learning it in practice. There's a balance between the resources and what you can achieve. And 55 countries, boy, that's a challenge. You're right. In Asia, 25 countries. Latin America, 25 countries. Just by yourself, if someone comes to me as the executive director and say you can do 2 continents or 1, let's face it, 2 continents is nicer than 1 continent. Same amount of money. If the resources are limited, and potentially even if not, would it make sense to, for instance, start the process within the East African community, which is also a legitimate political body, where maybe the example of Kenya can shine? Or does it make sense to look at, sometimes I jokingly refer to as the big 6, not the big 5, but the big 6, but Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, DRC, Nigeria, the 6 most populous countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think those are strategic considerations for the working group to take on board in terms of priorities. But again, these are just thoughts that occurred, and for the working group to take on board further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there is literally no limit in terms of the extent to which we can reflect, because the idea is, let's put all our ideas on the table. We can further refine, restructure, and focus, but it's important that we bring our thoughts there. I think, Jap, you had your hand up for a while. No? Okay. All right. We have about 14 minutes still to go. We don't necessarily need to use all the 14 minutes, but just in case that you still have 1 or 2 burning contributions to make, then yeah, Paddy.
Can I say many of us are burning on this side, so I won't be speaking on behalf of myself. I'll even hand over the mic.
All right. No, thank you very much. I mean, this was the idea of me standing.
Because it was a question, and I hope that's okay with your permission, Chair.
Sure.
I was just thinking,
Yes.
I mean, the African Union operates through its sub-regional organizations. And as we're talking about the Pan-African Network, but also looking a little bit more about the roles of the RECs. And I look on the side of my sister here to understand a little bit more are we missing the point also with not engaging with the RECs as they are doing? And what do we learn from there? Because I think that's another approach to Jamie's response in terms of maximizing resources and also picking out champions from the different regions. Another thing I also find in African spaces is that if we're leaning too much to the big countries, small countries like the Gambia, they'll come and say, we are small but mighty. And then they'll give you examples. And coming from a small country myself, I have the same feeling. So I think that also helps us, I think, when we go to the RECs level, that we kind of demystify, but just also being careful to find out that we're not losing the point on the national, I think, like we've talked about.
Yeah, no, that's a very important observation, Paddy, because in any case, the AU operates through RECs. And I think it's important to recognize that through regional economic communities, and the role of the regional economic communities therefore would be very central. We are talking about devolution, decentralization. Of course, we must already recognize the principle of subsidiarity in that regard. Yes, can I see the hands that were burning on this side before I burn myself?
Before she goes. Paddy wants me to say something, but I think she has elaborated it very well. Bringing on board the representatives of the RECs is very important. I always believe that instead of reinventing the wheel, you always leverage on existing structures. We're looking for entry points where we can easily mobilize and bring on board the voice of the national. And who best to mobilize that voice than the regional RECs? So for me, I would give a very big support to that recommendation to onboard them and work with them, and maybe also reinforce my support and on the proposition by Jamie to work through the structures, for example, like IALGA at regional level, who are already operating within the area and who are already covering a certain large number of countries. Looking at IALGA already, you already have 9 or so countries on table. And when you bring it a little bit closer home, I shared already that part of the work we do takes us to have a relationship in the southern regional angle. So already part of the work I do, for example, under Strong Cities, we engage SADC as well. So already you have another REC coming through that angle as well. And more countries coming on board.
Thank you so much. Finally, there's consensus. Judy?
She actually really responded to that, because that was my question. And I was just trying to look around because we have here the southern, the eastern, and the western. And remember, when designing these questions, we wanted to already have in mind that you're giving birth now to the Pan-African Association network for local governments. So can we look at now the existing structures? We know strongly, and I think what Rose has also forgotten, and I'll also just top up to what he has said, is there is already an advocacy element within IALGA, even to the ESC, including pushing for an observer position within ESC, pushing for representation of local governments within the Council of Ministers at the ESC. So that's really at an advanced stage. I wonder how we can also build on this within the other ones that are maybe just growing, or can we use that now, given that we're already working with the SADC, to give birth to SADC, and then we look at West Africa and how can we provide that support. Once we reach at a certain level, really, then we can say we have a voice to minimize the questions that Paddy was talking about. When you come here, who are you? Who sent you? What can we do for you? Those should not be questions. They'll be looking and saying, oh, if you're here, we would like to listen to you. So changing completely the narrative around that. So those are things we can begin looking at when you come to the existing structures, instead of reinventing the wheel. Just to also add on what Boris spoke about, when you talk about, for example, the common issues that run across the 3 regions, those are also some things that we can begin thinking about, that we can say these are the low-hanging fruits, and say if we already have success in providing, or undertaking this voluntary local reviews, how can we start building on the rest so that we are all, coming together at one level. That is just one element. We can also pick on other topics that you can ride on, really to begin, fast tracking and growing this baby called the Pan-African Network of Decentralization Champions. And I like the fact that even I think we had presentations today talking about we need champions, we must advocate, we need data, and so on and so forth. So that would be my submission, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think one thing that we have taken for granted, and I think we just need to clarify that, is that there is a certain degree of appreciation, if not a consensus, that what otherwise used to be a working group on sub-Saharan Africa would have to evolve into a Pan-African network, and that there's value and merit in that. I think that has been taken for granted, and I think unless someone really has a dissenting view to that, I would like us to proceed with that assumption. And
I will help you as a co-chair with Yapia, and I know here.
All right, thanks.
We were actually doing this so that you come to the realization that you are pregnant.
I thought so.
And you're going to deliver this baby today. So the questions around creating the Pan-African Network, from the deliberations from yesterday, from the webinars we've been holding, from the demand from the members to have this meeting, was really to begin to think about how can we give birth to this network. Seated here now today, and I know we are going to crown it all together tomorrow with an experience from Kenya, picking on issues that we know critically. This will move us towards, fast tracking this debate.
And I would have been the midwife.
Yes.
Jappy.
Thanks. And I think we're making these arguments not because we assume that everyone in the network thinks alike, argues alike, and has the exact same point of view, because that's unrealistic. That's not how we operate. There are many different viewpoints, even on some critical issues where we butt heads and we disagree, and that's absolutely fine. That's the nature of a network. So I think that should also, temper our ambition slightly, because we will not fully agree on every lobbying point for the entire continent and each and every country. We cannot. So we need to, be realistic when it comes to that. And of course, there's limited resources to what we can achieve. And I think, if I understand the original conceptualization of LPSA, I always thought it was leaning a little bit more to, elevating debate, thought leadership, critical analysis, pushing the needle here and there, but not sort of a strong dogmatic point of view, pushing everything in one direction. So we have to find sort of that middle ground, because decentralization is a very complex issue. There are many different drivers in many different countries. Realities. It is what it is. I remember that phrase from this morning. There are lots of moving parts, and we will not be able to control every moving part. So that's the one point I wanted to make. The other point is going back to the point that we have repeated a few times, is that in the end, the drivers are going to be primarily domestic, and I still believe that. And I wouldn't want us to devote 90% of LPSA's resources to chasing what I still think is a fairly elusive AU interest in decentralization. Maybe at the regional level it's different. I'm not qualified to. So I think let's also be careful in that, because there's so much work to be done domestically. For example, winning hearts and minds. I'm thinking of the process that unfolded in Kenya. We were involved in a series of training initiatives with judges, and that maybe that actually made quite a difference, that the judiciary started being switched on to devolution, and I think in Kenya it made a big difference. Now, what if the judiciary in Zimbabwe and in Zambia and in Mozambique would be switched on to decentralized? That's another way of looking at the same problem, looking at what are the entry points, or the media. The folks that were here yesterday, how much do they grasp of what devolution really is? Because the leaning is immediately to, oh, it's all corruption, counties don't know what they're doing, and we need more skills and expertise, and do they understand that bigger picture, and what role could we play in winning hearts and minds domestically, in pushing the needle in that way? So just another thought for the discussion.
Thank you so much. We have basically 3 minutes to conclude the conversation now. But I mean, in concluding, doesn't mean that everything that has been said, we have concluded. I mean, the session is towards a Pan-African network of decentralization. So what we've done so far is, first and foremost, just to recap, we do find value in elevating the debate to a level where indeed this community of practice that Rose made reference to a little earlier evolves into a relatively more strong, solid network of practitioners, academics, researchers, advocates, activists who are pushing the agenda, who believe in decentralization, in localization, and who have something to say and something to contribute to that. In which case, I think when we even look at resources, we should not just be thinking of monetary resources. I think around this room, there's enormous resources. I mean, the thought leadership that has been spoken about, I can't see where else one could look up to in terms of resources. So there is that kind of evolution of that particular network. The form and the shape and the operationalization, that's a conversation that has to continue. Fortunately, there's another session tomorrow that can take that further. First, before we continue, soon the time will be up. I don't want to be embarrassed. So we have to agree, are we extending the time? By how much? So that I don't seem to be the moderator who failed to manage time. 10 minutes. Okay, Jackie, 10 minutes. Thank you. Then Jam, you can respond.
Just, I mean, from my very limited experience, it is impossible for a small organization to interact with 50 or 55 countries. But it can interact very well in strong partnerships with East Africa level organization, a SADC level organization, and an ECOWAS level organization. So if the Africa Working Group were to divide itself up like that, you can see you have an annual get-together through a decentralization school. You might be able to organize an annual get-together like this. Jackie is here. She does all the work anyway. Why do I need to be here? Other than if you invite me as a resource person, right? So, and then it's up to yourselves to organize which countries. I think to me, it's been tremendously interesting and, to see experiences from different parts of the sub-Saharan Africa, Western, Eastern, Southern come together here. But if you have, from an operational point of view, strong partners, 3 strong partners can do a lot. And within those sub-regions, you can do a lot. Of course, within your country, you are the expert. So I think in principle, yes, but it is for the working group to figure out the mechanics of what do you want to do? How do you structure that? To me, I see partnerships with the East Africa Local Government Association as a really good opportunity where, you say, how can we support you in doing what you're doing? What can we bring from our knowledge base? What can you bring from your knowledge base? Of course, the activities are ultimately country-centric.
Okay, we now have 7 minutes, which we can use to pretty much wrap up. I was just summarizing and concluding before Nicholas started another debate. So to start from the beginning, no, to continue. I think really the discussion points to, yes, we can continue and we can elevate and we can strengthen the network. And there have been a number of areas that have been identified as areas where the network can be more relevant. And I think if we had time, there were some specific areas that I thought we could have reflected upon. For instance, what role can the School for Decentralization play? You know, should we not leverage on such kind of existing initiatives? Because that's already something that it's structured, it's there, you know, there's a curriculum. Is this not the kind of entity that you would say, in a setup like this, we identify the gaps, the areas that need further knowledge generation, and then we task and we contribute to, and the resource persons are here, and then they contribute to that. I think it's important that we build based on, I think, on what is already existing. And I think we also probably could have further reflected upon the idea that Nicholas was advancing. Do we see this as a network that is engaging with existing other entities or replicating? Because I think one thing that no one wants to do is to replicate. I mean, we already have too many things. If we listened to the previous speakers, there's already so much normative frameworks. There's so much that has been put up there. What we are lacking is implementation. So I think this is something that we could have further reflected upon. But again, I think to conclude, it's great to see that there's that kind of momentum, there's that kind of energy, there's that kind of will. And I guess at this point, we can pause the conversation and look forward to continue the conversation further tomorrow as we first listen to the Kenyan experiences, further deepen, and we can learn something from there. And then in the afternoon, the more working group reflection can pick up these issues and feed back to the wider audience. And I know that there's a big announcement to be made in the next 5 minutes regarding this evening. So I want to make sure we have enough time to have that big announcement. Thank you so much, dear colleagues. And I think we owe ourselves a big round of applause.
Before that big announcement, I do want to take 2 minutes to say thank you to someone who has made sure that we're all here and who has made sure that we're physically in this location with this beautiful view, and has been really tremendously taken the burden of making all the little arrangements that has made this happen. She was also one that pushed me, and I fear flying from now on. But I did want to make sure that we take 1 minute. Tomorrow we're going to be in a different setting. We've been together now for 2 days. We'll still have time together, so it's not a farewell. But I did want to take a moment to say thank you to Jackie and thank her for all the good things. And as a small token of appreciation, apparently KK is not the only golf fanatic in Kenya, so congratulations.
And I should be opportunistic to say, when I looked at what was in that bar, I was much gratified.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, KK. Thank you so much, Jamie.